Welcome to our video podcast of European Resilience Initiative Center from Berlin. And today in our podcast episode, I have an amazing guest, Professor Monika Sus, who is a visiting professor at Hertie School at the Center for International Security, and who is an expert in all the things in Europe which are about defense, security, and all the questions which are of incredibly importance nowadays. So I'm happy to welcome you.
Hello.
And I'm happy to ask you the first question. What has changed in the perception of the EU security after the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine?
So I think you can twist the question and ask what hasn't changed in the perception of the EU security indeed, because so much has changed, I think. So first of all, I would like to start with saying that I think for the EU, the invasion came as a surprise, which might be surprising for many Ukrainians, Poles, or the Baltic states, country citizens. But still, I think for most of the Western European countries, the invasion came as a surprise. And in Brussels, it was really also, I think the people didn't want to believe what we have been hearing from, for example, the US or, as I said, Poland or the Baltic states, that the invasion is actually coming. And then on one day in February, as you know, it happened, and the surprise element was really huge. So, and from this moment, I think we should really we should take a, let's say, a bigger look at what has happened at the EU. It was a watershed moment. I think there is no disputing that, because the war is back on the European continent, and I think it was really very much highlighted by any possible EU officials that the war is now back. So after the Balkan Wars in the 90s, we have again the war on the European continent, and the EU has to react to the war as swiftly as possible.
But that was an invasion, of course, was a huge tragedy, and it brought a lot of suffering to people in Ukraine. But for the EU defense policy, or for countries which used to tell about this danger for years, was it not that I told you so?
Of course, yes, of course. I mean, as you know, I'm from Poland, so from the Polish perspective, it was very much so that many Poles, not only, of course, me, but many Poles also here in Berlin, we have been talking with our German friends and counterparts that something like that is cooking, and Russia is a threat to European security, like a very serious threat to European security. But we have been told that we are exaggerating, and that Russia is actually can be considered as a partner, at least in the field of, for example, energy cooperation, and for a long time. We didn't want to be hurt, I think, in the Western Europe. But then again, I mean, I have to say that since the invasion, we see change in the EU security and defense. For example, as you know, we have now the European Peace Facility, an instrument that has been actually created, I think, in 2021. But it was always a taboo for the EU to supply weapons to conflict zones.
So always bilateral.
Exactly,
weapons.
yes, but not by the EU and not in a joint policy instrument. And this has changed. So a taboo has been broken. So now with the European Peace Facility, the EU is indeed supplying weapons or financing weapons that the member states can supply them. This is a big change, I think. Then again, you can laugh if you are not an expert of the EU, let's say bureaucracy, but the speed in which the EU introduced sanctions against Russia was actually quite amazing. Again, for EU standards. So we have I think 10 sanctions packages. Of course, we can discuss whether the sanctions are working or not, but I think that overall the reaction of the EU was surprisingly united.
In this change of the EU defense and security policy, what role does Poland play? Because when you look from the Ukrainian perspective, you would say, okay, Poland is leading. Is it true?
I mean, to some extent, certainly yes. So Poland is at the forefront, of course, if it comes to not only supplying weapons, because of course there are other countries. The US is of course the biggest supplier of the weapons. Then we have the UK, but also Germany is actually stepping up. If we are talking about supplying of weapons, but also Poland is at the forefront of the humanitarian and economic help to Ukraine. And of course, Poland welcomed a big number of migrants and refugees coming from Ukraine. But again, if it comes to the EU measures, I think there are two aspects that we have to take into account. One is, of course, that Poland is, of course, actively engaged in the EU measures, for example, also via European Peace Facility, and also supports sanctions against Russia very fiercely. But on the other hand, Poland has made it very clear that if it comes to territorial defense, the United States is the most important ally. So Poland is one of the countries actually within the EU that puts a lot of attention, that there is like no duplication, of instruments, that there is like no competition between the EU and NATO in this field. And I think that the stance of Poland is shared by not only the Baltic states, but also by the countries in the region. And I would also assume that it is also shared by Ukraine, because like for Ukraine, I think, or without the United States, I think the situation of Ukraine would have been totally different.
When that is extremely important what you're saying about the like some sort of competition, security competition between the existing institutions and alliances like NATO and the EU, or some like regional alliances which are emerging there. When we look at Parliament, I personally look at the Polish like defense purchases, and I see how many tanks Poland buys, not from Germany, from South Korea. Yes. Artillery systems being built, HIMARS artillery systems being bought, like new warplanes. Poland has launched naval drills this week in the Baltic Sea. So we have we observe a huge increase on the military capacity of Poland now and much more in the future. What will this mean for the security architecture in Europe and in NATO? Like, do we want it or not? It will mean a huge shift in the gravitation within Europe.
Sure. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think Poland, or the Polish president, announced an increase of defense budget up to 4%. So it will be one of the biggest defense budgets in Europe. And at the same time, of course, Poland has set a really ambitious targets if it comes to the number of soldiers, for example, but also, as you mentioned, as it comes to the equipment, which is important, right? And by the way, Poland is not buying from Germany because Germany has nothing to sell in the military equipment. So we are basically buying off the shelves. So we are looking for allies to sell us an equipment that is existing already or will be produced soon. I think this is the most important baseline for Poland in the moment. And yes, you have a lot of experts who argue that not only the Polish army, by the way, but also the Ukrainian army after the war will be one of the strongest armies in the world, right? So definitely on the continent, that their armies will be much stronger than, of the Germany or of most of the European countries. At the same time, Poland has no nuclear weapons. So this is like, that sets a limitation to the power of the potential alliances that Poland can create. And also, I think that it very much depends on Washington again, because as I said in the beginning, for Poland, Washington or the United States is the most important ally. And Poland, at least, in my opinion, won't do anything that can harm the strength of NATO, for example, because it will definitely also mean, harming the US. And this is not something that Polish government, this one, but also very much probable the next government also would not want to harm the biggest ally in the region, which is the United States.
That is extremely important, as we know, like since years or maybe even decades, we have seen that the Poles always relied on the United States military support. Yes. And provided like some options to the US, which were of extreme importance for the US, like installing the components of the anti-missile defense system. That's right. In Poland, like the radars. Does it mean what you're talking that Poland doesn't want to undermine NATO? What also means in Europe, Germany and France. And France is the only nuclear power in the EU. Can France and Germany somehow like rethink our position in this dispute? We have already observed how Germany changed its position regarding the Leopard 2 tanks and provided the green light for delivery. And we have seen also how Germany within one day approved the delivery of MiG-29 planes from Poland to Ukraine. Can we see some like light in the end of tunnel in this German-France-Poland dispute?
I mean, I don't really see that Germany and France are on the same line, let's say, because for me, Germany is actually much closer to, let's say, the mainstream of NATO countries. And also for Washington, Germany is one of the closest allies on the continent. So I think that Germany is moving, let's say, towards more of the direction of Poland and of the Baltic states, also by strengthening, for example, its presence on the eastern flank, which has been happening for quite some time. For France, whereas I think it's a completely different picture. I think France has France has a more global outlook. And this is like, of course, it's a very important war because this is happening on our continent, but still France has also, a lot of priorities that go beyond Europe. So I don't really see, France supporting Ukraine so much as, for example, Germany does. So I think there is a change in German policy, but I think also because of the weakness of the Bundeswehr, it will take a lot of time for Germany to actually, step up and be able to really be a credible ally in the eyes of, for example, Ukraine or Poland. And again, its credibility suffered a lot. I mean, German credibility, because simply the energy dependency, for example, between Germany and Russia was very strong. And for, quite some time, Germany didn't want, to accept that Russia can actually pose a threat to the continent. So that has changed. We are talking about, the famous Zeitenwende. So the concept that Chancellor Scholz brought up, I think, a year ago. But we are in the very beginning of it. So the process will take several years, to really happen.
As a German citizen, I can tell you when we are talking about the rapid changes, we normally think like 6 to 8 years.
It's very rapid, yeah.
Thinking about the military alliances beyond the NATO and the EU, if we look at the military cooperation between Ukraine and not only Poland, but also Baltic states, Germany, France, the US, the UK, we see how strong the integration, the de facto integration of the Ukrainian army into the NATO standards has already happened. And Poland plays a crucial role in arming Ukraine. Some friends of mine in Ukraine say that it is unbelievable to see how the Polish artillery systems, howitzers, and other weapons are fighting in Ukraine under the Ukrainian flag. That is what we could not imagine like 3-5 years ago. Nobody believed it is possible. It is now a new reality. How do you think can NATO or some members of NATO integrate Ukraine into their defense strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not only about integrating Ukraine into the defense strategies, but also about providing Ukraine with serious security guarantees. I mean, post-war Ukraine, obviously. I think one of the ways to go is certainly to extend some kind of security guarantees to Ukraine that actually are, let's say, serious and really were formulated and also perceived by Russia as serious enough, because I think this is one of the important things, of course. And as you say, the integration between the Ukrainian military forces and Polish or British, which is also, I think, British force also a strong component here, but also between Ukrainian and the Baltic states, is actually the best way to go. So, because I think that, as much as we might wish for it, the accession of Ukraine to NATO is probably not in the cards for the time being and for foreseeable future. I'm of course aware of the fact that Ukraine, it is in the constitution of the country, to join NATO, to join the EU. And I think that whereas the membership of the EU is actually something that we can count for within a decade, maybe, it's different for NATO for several reasons. So I think for me, the best way to go will be, as you also mentioned in your question, try to integrate Ukraine via backdoor as much as we can in NATO structures, in NATO defense planning, but also, as I mentioned, in NATO security strategies, security guarantees, sorry.
That is somehow like a paradox. Ukrainian army is one of the strongest and most experienced in Europe. Like maybe the U.S. army can be seen as more experienced, of course, as Ukraine, and much stronger. But if we look at the combat experience against one of the biggest threats nowadays. The Ukrainian army has the most of that experience and has proven to be really resilient, really strong. Ukraine could be an asset for NATO, but as you say, many countries in the NATO are not ready to vouch for Ukraine. So how can this like backdoor integration can look like? Is it like some sort of bilateral alliances and assurance and guarantees?
Yeah, I mean, 2 points. I think you're totally right that Ukrainian army, I mean, it's already, as you said, very strong, but I think it will be even much stronger after the war. And I think this is something that we have already understood in Europe and on the other side of the Atlantic. On the other hand, in order to be a member of NATO, a country has to contribute to the overall security of NATO, right? This is written in the treaties. And considering the geopolitical position of Ukraine, I think it's very difficult to countries like Spain or Portugal actually, to see it that way. That by let's say opening the door to Ukraine, NATO will strengthen its security. So because of the obvious threat of Russia, and of course this is like the red line, I think, for Russia. I mean, certainly it is a red line for Russia. The backdoor integration. I think that it is already happening to some extent, because of joint equipment that we use, because of the joint trainings. So I would really rather go for that, like intensifying. For example, joint missions. We can train the soldiers together. I mean, this is happening. And for example, Poland, before entering NATO or before being admitted to NATO, there was a range of different activities that Poland was engaged as, a candidate country. And I think that, NATO could be maybe able to find a creative way of offering a similar perspectives for Ukraine, because as you said, I mean, this is absolutely crucial for NATO that Ukraine is a stabilized country with strong security guarantees.
Wow, thank you. It was an amazing interview with Monika Sus, who is a visiting professor at Hertie School in Berlin at the Center for International Security. Thank you for your insights
and
for your expertise. We have learned a lot about how we can guarantee security for Ukraine for longer perspective and support our security in Europe. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, European Resilience Initiative Center, and please donate for our activities as we help Ukraine. We provide humanitarian support for Ukrainian NGOs and for Ukrainian army and organize such great interviews with great experts. Thank you so much.